So FIFO costing, we know from financial accounting that FIFO inventory is first in, first out. And it's pretty logical, right? If you got a factory assembly line and you got calculators flowing down it, and it starts with a bunch of little pieces and it ends with a whole calculator, the first one that went in is the first one that goes out, probably, right? So that's how we cost it. We kind of cost it with the assumption that the first one in is the first one out, which means all the work in process, like every month. Let's say you're doing your inventory every month. So whatever's in the work in process at the beginning of the month, you assume came out sometime during the month, and then anything else came in after that. So the first stuff in came out first. All right. So the equivalent units from the beginning work in process are excluded because they got counted in the last month. All right. And the work cost carryover from the ending work in process. All right. So here's kind of an example of a production report for using FIFO. So if you'll look here, you'll see there's no beginning work in process in the equivalent units because we assumed they went out, they were costed in the last month. All right, but we had units started and completed, so that's 75,000, and units at work in process. So here's the direct material equivalent units, and then here's your conversion costs. You had to have some units that you started and completed, and then you had some units work in process that do have conversion costs. The reason there's no beginning work in process is because, remember, on direct materials, you pulled all the materials when you started them and they got counted from before. But with the conversion costs, no, you're still working on them. You still have to have your direct labor and your overhead added and your ending work in process. So you end up with equivalent units. So when I go to do my costing, right, to figure out my unit cost for 1 unit for this month, I'm going to say for direct materials I need to cost 105,000 things. And for conversion costs, whatever those turn out to be, I need to cost 91,500 things. All right? So in a production report for 3 departments, you're telling us what needs to be accounted for, right? So here's the totals, right? And here's the totals, and you divide it by those equivalent units. So that's what the equivalent units are for. When I get my total costs and I divide it by those equivalent units, and it gives me a cost per equivalent unit. And then that lets me go ahead and value my inventory. All right, so I can then go ahead and value my inventories and move from one to the next using my journal entries. So I think, again, if you go watch me work the problems, it'll probably make a little more sense because I describe it as I'm going along. But I think you get the idea is that we have to figure out how many units we did during the month. We have to figure out how much we spent to make those units total, because that's how you track costs, right? You don't trace them to each individual single unit. You just like, I know we paid the direct labor this much. I know that we spent this much on direct materials. So to get a per unit cost, you divide those totals by your equivalent units. So you need the equivalent units to figure out a per unit. Then you need the per unit to figure out what is actually in each of the inventories. All right. So let's stop and we'll talk about weighted average. Same idea, but we don't assume there's no beginning work in process for direct materials. Okay, be back with you in a minute.